of a post on the social medias not long ago. I don't know, it was a month or two ago. Anyway, a buddy of mine I graduated with, he had posted our graduation picture from college, not high school, okay? So it wasn't way back in the olden days, but it's still a while back. Anyway, he posted a thing saying, it was 29 years ago we graduated from college, and then he went on to say, I couldn't have made it without my friend Kevin, right? And it's funny because I'm like, oh, that's funny because I couldn't have made it without him. And so that ties into what, Brent was getting at, that, we flock together and we encourage and we lift one another. And it shouldn't be that, I never thought of it that way, that my buddy wouldn't have made it if it hadn't been for me, but I had thought that I wouldn't have made it if it hadn't been for him. And actually, there was more than one buddy that helped get me through school. And that's how our life should be, right? We should be seeking out people to help lift us up and carry us along. And we've talked about that before, right? You want to pick out the good ones to team up with, right? When I started college, my brother said, you got to find the best, the smartest, and the brightest study buddies to help get you through, which is what I did. And they lift you up and carry you along. And that's why you're here, amen. Right? If you look around, this is the best and the brightest, okay? So we're all in this together. Yeah, it does encourage me. Well, we're marching our way through the book of Matthew, right? The first gospel in the New Testament. And as we're marching through Matthew, where we're at, Jesus is marching towards Jerusalem and the final days of his life. And we're gonna jump right in, but I want to backtrack just a little bit. That we noted here a few weeks ago when Jesus was at the gates of hell. Do you remember that? We talked about that. There was this cave, and the pagan religions believed that was the gates of hell, and there was spiritual darkness there. And Jesus was there talking to the disciples. And we looked at the fact that many theologians say, well, they were on a retreat. And if going on a retreat means you go to where deep, dark witchcraft and sexual immorality happens, and taking a group of believers there as some kind of retreat, that's a possibility. But we looked at it and we challenged ourselves to think, well, no, maybe there was more going on there, and Jesus was pointing out, right? He said that the gates of hell shall not prevail against his church. And that, in fact, Jesus was going to build his church on this rock, right? That rock being people that have been transformed and changed by his Spirit, right? And those are the kind of people that are going to build the kingdom. Remember that, right? And we also noticed that Jesus, when he was there, mentioned that he was going to die. First time he mentioned it. And now, as we start out today, we're going to see the third time he's mentioned it in just a few short weeks. And before we get started, let's pray. Father, I just ask that you be with us as we open your word, to study it, to know more of you. We pray that our hearts would be receptive to what your Spirit has for us today. We just ask this in Jesus' name. And they all said, amen. Okay, so we're in Matthew 20, verse 17. It says, and as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and he will be raised on the third day. So let's try to put ourselves in the situation. What's going on here? As I've read this and studied this, literally over the years, Jake, here's your bingo card. I've ruminated on this quite a bit. Okay, but you ponder it, right? Because how can Jesus sit there and say, "Hey, I'm going to Jerusalem," and this is pivotal This is foundational in the understanding of Jesus coming here and offering himself as a sacrifice, right? It wasn't like Jesus got to Jerusalem and the plan didn't work out, right? Jesus right now, before he goes to Jerusalem, is saying, hey, I'm going to Jerusalem, and I'm going to get delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, right? So he knows that he's going to this, and they'll condemn him to death, and he'll get delivered to the Gentiles. Kind of an interesting fact, right? And as you ruminate on this, or as you think about it, what is going on here? Jesus is pointing out all these things that are going to happen, and the disciples, right? He's taken them aside, so we know it's not in passing. He's taken the disciples aside and said, hey, this is what's going to happen. And we don't get the feel, especially when we look at the next section, we don't get the feel that the disciples are like, whoa, this is heavy, right? They're just like, eh. And I've often wondered, how does you go, eh, instead of, digging in a little deeper? And I think maybe, right, and this is just speculation, but perhaps they thought it was a parable or that it was hyperbole, right? Apparently, they didn't remember when Jesus first said this, right? Peter jumped up and said, hey, this is not going to happen. We're not going to let you die. And Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. Remember that, right? So here, it's still not clicking. And as I've thought about this, I don't know, it leaves me a little conflicted inside, but we're going to look at the parallel passage over in Luke 18. So this is the parallel story written by another author, right? As he documented it, it says, and basically in his telling of the story, he says all the stuff we just saw, and then he finishes up with Luke 18:34. He says, but they understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what he said. So even Luke must have known that someday we'd come along to this point and go, what the heck was going on? Because he points out that it was hidden from them. They didn't know. And so as we read this, we're not off the mark to see it. It doesn't look like the disciples got it, because they literally didn't. They didn't. They're like, what? Don't know what's going on. So we're going to jump into this next section. So he's just said that he's going to be turned over and crucified, right? That's not an honorable way to die. Okay, that's a horrible way to die. Shameful way to die. And we've seen in the last few dialogues Jesus talking about greatness. Right? Remember, he's talked about what it takes to be great. And in fact, we're going to look at Matthew 19:28. We're just going to back up a little bit. And I want you to get this in your mind, because this next story kind of comes out like, once again, you're going, what are they thinking? But in Matthew 19, verse 28, it says, Jesus said to them, this is just a few passages up, truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And this was, if you remember, this was right after Jesus talking about the camel going through the eye of the needle, right? It's easier for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to get through the eye of the needle. And we talked about the fact that it probably really, what Jesus was getting at was, a literal camel through a literal eye of a needle. And right after that, Peter's like, well, but Lord, we gave up everything. And Jesus goes on to say, well, you know what? You have given up everything. And when we come into the new world, you're going to be on 12 thrones. Okay, so they're going to be on thrones. The apostles are going to be on 12 thrones. But they've often struggled with what it takes to be great, right? And what's one of the great things, or what does it take to be great? Well, one of them is being like a child, right? We saw that, Rich. Back in the day, children had no rights, They weren't expected to live long, kind of treated more like property than people. And so that's what it takes to be great in God's kingdom. So now, with that little bit of background, let's jump back in here. And so we're at Matthew 20:20. It says, "Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, 'What do you want?' She said to him, 'Say that these two sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom.'" Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. So Jesus has said they're going to rule, because if we didn't know the back history of the fact that, yeah, Jesus said they were going to sit on 12 thrones, it seems like this might be coming out of nowhere. But no, there's a little bit of backstory that at least helps us understand what's going on. And it's a little bit of a power play, okay? And so it's interesting that mom's involved, right? So somebody might be saying, well, it sounds like she was a copter mom, right? And what's the other one they call them? Snowplow moms, right? Where the mom just pushes everything out of the way so their kids can succeed, right? That happens. We see that today. And there's also psychology in this, right? Because, and they probably weren't thinking psychology. And when I say psychology, I'm not saying, oh, psychology is great. I'm just saying the study of human nature, okay? Human nature, if say I have something against Stuart, or I want to ask Stuart for a favor, right? I might ask Matt to kind of break the ice a little bit, right? So Matt might come up and go, "Hey, Stuart, Kevin would like to, buy your motorcycle." And if Stuart goes, "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," then it's buffered, right? Because Stuart's not yelling directly at me. He's kind of yelling at Matt, but then he realizes, well, Matt's not the guy that's asking. Matt's asking for somebody else. So it kind of softens the blow a little bit. That's the human nature part of it. So there's probably a little bit of that going on, right? Because what happens? Mom comes up, got the boys in tow, right? And these aren't little leaguers, right? These are adult men, fishermen, okay? Comes up, and it says that she kneels before Jesus, right? I got a favor. And Jesus is like, "What do you want?" And she said, "Well, my boys, my strapping boys, I want one at your right hand, one at your left hand when you come into your kingdom." Now, you and I look at that and go, wow, yikes. It seems like what do the kids call it? That's a big ask, right? It's a big ask. And it says, and Jesus answered, verse 22, and he said, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" And they said, "We are able." So I love the fact that Jesus doesn't beat them up for the request, right? He doesn't say, "What are you thinking?" Which would probably be my inclination. I'm like, wow, what are you even thinking? But he says, he breaks it down. He's like, do you even know what you're asking? Right? You and I have 20/20 vision, hindsight, because we know what it's going to look like when Jesus comes into his kingdom, right? Is there going to be somebody on his right and on his left? Yeah, two thieves. And the cup he's going to drink is the cup of crucifixion, right? I imagine when John was there when Jesus was crucified, this may have kind of played in his mind like, oh, I didn't know what I was asking. And they say, yeah, we're able. Once again, they have no clue what that means. Verse 23, he said to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those whom it has been prepared by my Father." And you have to really appreciate Jesus at this point, because Jesus is even deferring to the Father on this selection, right, of who's at his right and who's at his left in his kingdom. He says the Father's in charge of that. Now, this isn't the end of the story because, well, let's see what happens. Verse 24, it says, And when the 10 heard it, they were all indignant at the two brothers. Okay, so we got the two guys, right? Mom's involved. They're wanting to go to the head of the corporate structure, right? You ever worked for a company that's got the tree and the order of hierarchy of who's who, right? They're wanting Jesus and then James and John. That's how they're wanting that to work out. And the others, right, the other 10, they get miffed. Okay, so what does that mean? What does it mean if they get miffed? Well, you and I can look at this and we go, oh, it's because they were offended, right? It says they were indignant. So the reason they're indignant is, well, they wanted some of that too, right? They were interested in being high on the throne, because if you had no interest, right? If the other 10 had no interest in being high-ranking official in Jesus' kingdom, which we know that's how you become great in Jesus' kingdom, is not become great, right? But if you have that attitude and somebody wants to become great, are you indignant? No, you're like, go for it, right? There's an old saying that if you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, the one that barks the loudest is the one you hit. Apparently, no one's heard that saying or thrown rocks at dogs. Okay? So a pack of dogs, right, that's a big group of canine, okay? And if you throw a rock, they're all going to bark, but the one that barks the loudest is the one that got hit, okay? So where's the parallel? Is there a parallel? Well, there is. And that is, if you say something and somebody gets really offended and they start barking, right? They start, oh, I can't believe, ooh, must have hit them, right? That hit home. So we can't look at James and John as being like, oh, I can't believe them. The rest of them had the same attitude because they were indignant. Verse 25, it says, but Jesus called them to him and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. And so that's why I'm saying, if Jesus wasn't offended, right? This was not a power struggle for Jesus, right? He's not like, oh, they're gonna, okay, in the world we live in today, right? If there's people coming up to you and you're a leader, a world leader, and they're like, hey, we want to get real close to, your position, we'd like to be second in command, a lot of times you might be a little leery of that. Like, oh, wait a minute, my position feels like it's in jeopardy. But here we clearly see Jesus doesn't feel threatened at all. In fact, he says, you don't know what you're asking. And then he says, if you want to be great, you got to be a servant. And we see that Jesus, from here on out, we're going to see him just continually serve. And we're going to see at the Last Supper, right, that he wants to wash their feet, the ultimate social servant work, because it was for the hired help. You're down there scrubbing the dirty feet. And Peter, right, and Peter chimed up and said, oh, you're not going to wash my feet. And Jesus says, you know what, if I don't wash your feet, you've got no part of me. Right? Jesus came to serve us. And if you don't let Jesus serve you, then you've got no part of Jesus. And then Peter's like, right, and we love it when Peter speaks up because it's always going to be a wild ride. And Peter's like, oh, then wash me all. And Jesus is like, no, you don't have to wash you all, right? If you've had a bath, just the dirty part needs cleaned. So, he points this out to the disciples, and once again, it just feels so, what's the word, tone deaf, that they're asking about this greatness right on the tail, right on the end of Jesus saying he's going to die in Jerusalem, right? And they're just not getting it. But I think that part of it, well, we know for sure, Luke told us that they didn't understand, And I think the other part of it, the way they rationalize it away is, oh, it's another one of his parables, right? Or it's hyperbole. Jesus was big into hyperbole and parables. So, it's done, it's over. Now, we're going to go on Matthew chapter 20, verse 29, and it says, "As he went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed him, and behold, there were 2 blind men sitting by the roadside. When they had heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, 'Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David.' The crowd rebuked them, telling them to be silent. But they cried out all the more, 'Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David.' And stopping, Jesus called them and said, 'What do you want me to do for you?' They said to him, 'Lord, let our eyes be opened.' And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him." So there's this story, right? So now they're getting closer to Jerusalem. They're in Jericho. And this story about healing these 2 blind men is in the 2 other synoptic gospels, right? Synoptic gospels, synoptic means similar, so the 3 similar gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, John's not a synoptic gospel because it's a little different. But the other 2 gospels, Mark and Luke, have this same story. And it's a little different. So we're going to go ahead and read that just because I want to give, and this is the beauty of having other gospels that we can kind of lean on that create a fuller picture. And many times, those that don't agree with the Bible or want to counter the Bible or are against the Bible, they'll use these differences and say it's a discrepancy, right? It's full of contradictions. But is it? We're going to take a look, and we're going to talk about contradictions and discrepancies. So we're going to go to Mark 10, verse 46 to 52. So this is Mark's account of the same story. And if you just a couple of highlight things is there was 2 people, we just read there were 2 people that were healed from being blind, and we don't know their names, right? So, Mark 10:46, it says, "And they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began crying out and say, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' And they called the blind man, saying to him, 'Take heart, get up, he is calling you.' And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And the blind man said to him, 'Rabbi, let me recover my sight.' And Jesus said to him, 'Go your way, your faith has made you well.' And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way." So here, as we read this, we see only one guy's mentioned. Right? That's the first thing. Only one guy's mentioned. And we also, all of a sudden, we know this guy's name. And not only do we know his name, we know his father's name. Okay? And we also know what he did. And what I think's going on here is, and we've talked about this at length, that each of the Gospels was written to a different audience, right? And Matthew was written to the Jews, okay, primarily. So there's a lot of Jewish themed elements in there. Matthew to the Jews. Mark was written to the Romans, okay, and it was a lot more concise, shorter, a lot of action. But it was a different audience. And I would think maybe, perhaps, the way we understand this, and so here in Mark, there's only one guy mentioned, right? Matthew has 2 guys. So a mathematical way of looking at this, if there are 2 guys, is there at least 1 guy? Okay, you guys did better with that than the dogs, I'm going to give you that. But yeah, if there's two, there's always one. And I've got a hunch the reason Mark points out Bartimaeus is because he probably had in mind the people he's writing to, they may have known Bartimaeus, right? Because it says from that point, Bartimaeus started following Jesus. So it's quite possible Bartimaeus gets saved, right, in the community, and he's known in the community that the book of Mark was written to, right? So it would be important, right? If somebody wrote a gospel or a message to our little church fellowship, right? And let's say, oh, Ken Plummer was there at some event, okay? Oh, and especially if I was writing to the church, right? And there was a couple of guys, and they did something fabulous, which we can see, of course, Ken doing something like that, right? Yeah, for sure. But I would point out that, oh, you know, Ken, right? The wife of Kim, that guy, right? The son of Carol, you know, right? You'd be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense, okay? However, if it was somebody, right, that doesn't go to this church, that doesn't really know who Ken is, you know, which is sad, right? But let's say they were writing to a church in Hood River, okay? They might go, those people in Hood River, sorry, they don't really care that if it's Ken or the daughter, or the son of Carol. Those details would mean nothing to them, so they add a little bit more depth that there was actually two people, right? Jim was there, right? They don't list that out, but they just point it out differently. They describe it differently because the audience is a little bit different. Does that make sense? Right? So it's not necessarily a contradiction. It's just a different understanding and observation of what happened. And I think in this particular one that, yeah, they probably a really good chance that Mark's audience knew who Bartimaeus was. And so that's why it's kind of listed out and detailed a little bit clearer there. And so what happens? They're leaving Jericho, right? That's a famous city back from the Old Testament, right? That's the first one they captured when they were coming into the Promised Land. Remember they marched around the city? Yes. Okay, and there are two cities, right? Because one city, guess what happened to it? Well, it fell down, right? We know that. And so they built the new Jericho not far away. So there's two. There's the ruined Jericho and the new Jericho. And you might be saying, what difference does that make? Well, actually, if you dig into this a little bit and you read Luke's gospel, the two we just read said that they were leaving Jericho, and in Luke's gospel it says they were entering Jericho. Like what? Could very well be that because there's two Jerichos, right? There's the ruins, which they call a tell, right? Tel Aviv. A tell is a mound, and usually a tell in that land is a ruined, abandoned city. Okay, so the old Jericho, new Jericho, if you're halfway between, are you heading to Jericho or are you leaving Jericho? Right, there's no wrong answer there. So, what happens, it says, they're leaving Jericho, we got these blind beggars. And it says, when they heard Jesus pass by, they cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. There's something for us to think about here. We've got the disciples who have been with Jesus this whole time, right? They're listening. He's talking about the fact that he's going to suffer. He's going to be crucified, turned over. And then they're like, yeah, but who's the greatest? I want to be greater than you because I'm greater than you. And they're doing this back and forth. And here's a blind guy, right, who's physically blind. But look at this. It says, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. Whoa, it sounds like these physically blind people, right, two of them, have greater sight and understanding of spiritual things than the disciples who have sight, right? So there's this rich contrast. And as we've seen countless times, whenever the rebuking starts happening, right, because, remember last time the disciples were rebuking the children, right? Well, what happens? Well, Jesus ain't going to put up with children being rebuked. And here it says that when they heard that Jesus was, they cried out, "Have mercy on us." And it says, verse 31, but the crowd rebuked them. So now it's not just the disciples joining in on the beat up on the poor and afflicted people. It's the whole crew. They're like, you know what? Just shut up. Have you ever had that urge to tell people that? Probably not wise to say it, but we've all had the urge, right? And they're like, hey, you know what? Just, right? They do that. And anyway, the crowd told them to shut up. And it said they cried out all the more. And that's encouraging, right? That's kind of warms your heart as, okay, and as I say, warms my heart, okay, with children, and they're crying out, and you like tell them to stop it, and they cry out all the more, it doesn't really warm your heart, right? Especially if you're a parent, just like, But here's somebody crying out to Jesus, right? And people are telling them to shut up, to stop, and they cry out all the more to Jesus. Now that's the part that warms your heart, okay? And it says that, verse 32, and stopping, Jesus called them and said, what do you want me to do for you? Now I'd like to jump back over to Mark. Must be, well, let me look, Mark 10. Over in Mark, it said, they called out, and they called the blind men, saying, take heart, get up, he is calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus, right? And a lot of theologians make note of the fact that this guy threw his cloak. And you might be saying, what's so big about throwing the cloak? Is it really worth even talking about? Well, I think so. Okay, so here you are. Let's imagine for a minute we're blind. Okay, so now it's me and one of you. And we're sitting there, and we've been blind, and we're beggars. We got our little cup. And now all of a sudden we hear Jesus is here. And we know Jesus is the Messiah. We know Jesus can heal us. Okay, and beggars don't have a lot. Okay, and your cloak, probably your tent too, and your sleeping bag, right? It's what's going to keep you warm in the cold of night. And it says he jumped up and he threw it off. Well, if you're blind, finding your cloak might be a problem, right? Especially in a big crowd. So apparently this guy, and whenever the Bible notes something like that, it's noteworthy, right? And you look at it and you're like, oh, he didn't care about the cloak. Apparently, he's expecting great things from Jesus. And I love the fact that when Jesus, he said, and they called the blind men, saying to him, take heart, get up, he is calling you. Throwing off the cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? And I suppose he could have said, yeah, just give me a couple of shekels, right? A couple of denarius, right? We know how much a denarius was, right? As a day's wage. They didn't ask for any of that. He said, give us our sight. I want to see. And that's the same thing that Jesus says to us when we first hear his voice, right? Jesus asks, what do you want? Oh, I want to see you clearly. Right? And that's what they're asking. We want to see. And it says, and this is what the guy says, and the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well, and immediately received his sight and followed him on his way. And so Jesus does heal him. Interesting, and here's some more controversy for those of you that like to ponder the controversy. Back in Matthew, verse 34, it says, and Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes, and immediately they recovered their sight. So he touched their eyes, but he also said that it was their faith that made them well. And we know they have faith, right? How do we know How do we know that he had faith? Well, he threw his coat away. He threw the cloak away, right? That's a guy with faith. Because at that point, it's like I threw my cloak down. I'm not worried about it because I'm soon going to get my sight and I can go find my cloak. But here, think about this. How would he know what color it was? Right? He's not going to know what it looked like, but he's going to be able to find it, and probably doesn't care at that point, right? Because at that point, now I can see, now I can get a job, now I can work, now my whole life has changed. So is a cloak all that important? Probably not. But we do see that there was a dramatic change in their life, a change that happened, and it's all because they had faith. And, you know, as we sit here and we look at these stories, right, if they hadn't been crying out, would Jesus have healed them? Well, probably not, because he didn't know, right? And that's something for you to think about, and there's a delicate balance. You might be thinking, well, you know, I don't want to ruffle anyone's feathers. I don't want to make a big scene. But these guys did. And they did make a scene. And everybody rebuked them. And that's one of the things. Remember, we're the top-notch group here, okay? But if you're hurting, sometimes we don't know, right? And sometimes you got to cry out and ask for someone to pray for you, right? If you're hurting, we don't always have all the answers, but we can hold your hand, right? Ken doesn't like it when I hold his hand, but no, he doesn't. But the point is that, and I don't always have the answers, right? I don't, but I can sit there with you, and we can sit there together, right? And we can lift your request up to the Lord, and we can make a big racket before the Lord.